Moving into a new decade of death metal, and this year, it was a tough one.
It's impossible.
Today we are ranking death metal albums from the year 2000, starting with Nile with Black Seeds of Vengeance. This basically takes everything great about the debut and steps it up. The atmosphere is bigger, the songwriting is more complex, the performances are more jaw-dropping. You get to that chanting part on Defiling the Gates of Ishtar, and we're really just slipping into transportation into historical Egypt. While so many other bands were smearing blood on the walls at this time, Nile were crafting worlds, so this one has to go to perfection. Then we have Incantation with the Infernal Storm. Shifting now to Mike Sayers on vocals, he's fine, but unfortunately, in my opinion, a real drop in the songwriting, with the repetition here really getting on my nerves. Anoint the Chosen kicks off hard, but it feels like we've lost some of the better pacing. Like, you still get a lot of different speeds on display here, but they seem to change almost at random without much care for the overall flow that Diabolical Conquest had. It just feels kind of sloppy to me, so for that, it went to okay. Then we have Kataklysm with the Prophecy, Stigmata of the Immaculate. Album 4 from this Quebec band, and at least a significant step back up from the last one. The production could still use a lot of work, and I don't really like the choice of guitar tone either, but I dig the increased emphasis on more melodeath sounding riffing and general heaviness. Much more interesting songwriting and performances that only get better the deeper you get in. Machiavellian in particular is a standout, definitely trending towards the side of this band that I actually enjoy, so it landed at Killer. Then we have Dark Tranquillity with Haven. Another album I love from one of my all-time favorite bands, and I'd argue that this is the album where they really fully transitioned into their current day sound. Very consistent, but also with some real standouts like Wonders at Your Feet, Not Built to Last, The Same Fabric, and Rundown. Killer riffs, anthemic vocals, and incredible atmosphere. I could argue putting this at perfection, but again, this was a very tough list, especially at the top levels, so it landed at fantastic. Then we have Nomenmortis with How I Learned to Bleed for the Things I Wish to Forget. The debut album from this Slovakian death metal band, fairly standard death metal, hearing elements of Immolation and Incantation in the cavernous atmosphere and gurgly, throaty vocals. It is interesting, though, in that it's less violent and menacing sounding than either of those bands, and rather kind of mournful and subdued a la Septic Flesh. Not my favorite, but still a recommended listen. It is going to good tier. Then we have Behemoth with Thelema 6.
Behold, bastard son, I am the evil one. Glory to be read.
Now, I know that some of the fans out there love this album from these Polish legends, thanks to mainstay bangers like Christians to the Lions, Venom Sabati, and 23 The Youth Manifesto. Anti-Christian Phenomenon has a pretty killer intro too. I just don't seem to get the same thrill that some of those people do listening to this from start to finish when stacked against some of what I consider to be their better albums in the likes of Zoskia Cultus and Demigod, but even so, it is a great listen on this list. It is going to amazing. Then we have Origin with Origin. The debut album from this technical death metal band, originally formed in Kansas. Never been a big fan of these guys, but it's better than their new stuff, I would say, and no doubt that those gravity blasts are a beast. I also find it to be a bit more engaging than some of the other albums on this list, with tracks like Sociocide and Infliction showing a bit more individual personality and memorability factor. It's only the vocals that I'm not really a huge fan of, so this landed at great. Yo, we have plenty more albums to go. We got like 40 here, but if you're enjoying the video so far, be sure to hit the like button. If you're not enjoying it, hit the dislike button and comment below what are your favorite and least favorite albums on this list, and also what might you add. But next up, we have Kalmah with Swamplord. One of the best and most underrated melodic death metal bands out there, and at very least in Finland's top 3, if you ask me. Evil in You, great opener with those folky leads just dancing around. Love the more warlike sounding Inheritance of Beresia and the kind of eerie and ominous dance of the water. Then there's fan favorite Hades, as well as great riffs on Alteration. Just such a triumphant sounding debut right from the start. Their sound already pretty much fully formed and just brimming with hooks and great synth work, which is actually kind of rare for even the best melodic death metal bands out there. So this landed at perfection. Check out my full discography Kalmah tier list if you're not familiar with them too. But next up we have Damnation with Resist.
Right man, I burn to kill your sacrifice.
The third and final album from this Polish band, and another one that's unfortunately the lowest fan rated from them. There are aspects of this album that I do like, namely the kind of chaotic shifting rhythms of the drums, but the riffs feel a little bit generic and the vocals are pretty bland. Not bad, but not great either, so it went to good tier. Then we have In Flames with Clayman. Similar to what I said about Dilemma 6, I've heard a lot of people choose Clayman as even their favorite album from this band, but I've just never really been in love with this one. Some serious favorites here like Bullet Ride and Pinball Map with killer riffs, punchy songwriting, and all of their best qualities on display. Only for the Weak and the title track are also standouts. Outside of that, I still think it's quite good, but just not as good as the albums that came before this one. So, still a strong one, still a great album, again, especially on this list. It's going to amazing. Then we have Benighted with Benighted. Been a huge fan of this French band's modern output, highly recommended if you like Aborted. This debut has a pretty rough mix and more black metal influence than their later stuff, just a cacophony of chaotic distortion and kind of bizarre vocals that sort of remind me of early Cradle of Filth, but even more grating, unfortunately. The only thing really of note is their interesting approach to how they implement more melodic elements, I would say. So this one landed at okay. But again, really love Benighted. Check out some of their later stuff in particular. Then we have Centinex with Hellbrigade. Album 5 from this underrated Swedish band. For some reason, despite most of their albums being on Spotify, this one is not. Getting the usual solid melodic death metal riffing and at the gates aggression, but the production is kind of weak on this one. Definitely plenty of great moments though, with the hooks and more almost Borknagar-esque atmospheric moments. Maybe not quite as strong as some of the others here, but still really damn enjoyable. It's going to killer. Then we have Lykathea Aflame with Elvenefris. This is some really impressive and ahead of its time progressive death metal that managed to be both beautiful and brutal at the same time, with its clear Middle Eastern influences complete with what sounds like some subtle simulated sitar. I'm a big fan of Cult of Fire, which in some ways I'd consider to be the black metal counterpart to this, and notably both bands have roots in Czechia. Easily among, if not the most unique album on this entire list that manages to be entrancing for its entire lengthy hour and 12-minute runtime. Another one I could make a case for perfection, but ultimately I put it at fantastic. Then we have Hypocrisy with Into the Abyss. Album 6 for these Swedes, and this one is a bit of a mixed bag, I would say. Some really solid melodic death metal like Legion's Descend and Digital Prophecy, solid symphonic atmosphere too, but then some stranger choices like the weird vocals on Resurrected and Fire in the Sky. Inconsistent, but when it's on, it's pretty on, so it's going to great tier. Then we have Deicide with Insineratehymn. The first real misstep from these Florida legends after a pretty strong 4-album run, in my opinion. It just feels very stripped-back and kind of dumbed down right down to the cover art. Frankly, it looks and often feels more like a 6 Feet Under album, though it's probably at least slightly better than that. Not awful, just kind of dull and sometimes even cringe, and that doesn't even seem to be an unpopular opinion, as this is the second lowest rated album from them on both Metal Storm and Metal Archives. Bible Basher is also the only song that regularly makes it into their set list. Not the worst thing here. I'm going to put it at good tier. Then we have Soilwork with the Chainheart Machine. Easily one of, if not their best album in my opinion. The riffs are insane, and Bjorn gives his most aggressive vocal performance of his career. The title track is also one of the best album openers in Melodeath, period, with that punchy sort of industrial sample before we kick right into high gear. Bullet Beast is a total banger. Generation Speedkill is a straight thrasher with super infectious scream-along moments. Start to finish, just an instant classic and top 10 melodic death metal album overall for me. So it went to perfection. Then we have Vader with Litany. An incredible album from these Polish death thrashers, and among my favorites. Wings is a banger of an opener, and then you've got Zephyr and the title track. Love the final Massacre as a closer. Tons of great scream-along elements on this one too, and a stronger vocal performance in general than their last album, I would say. Again, I'd love to put this at perfection. It really kind of tormented me, but I will admit that the production is kind of a mess, especially with the kind of goofy electronic-sounding bass drum. But ultimately, it went to fantastic. Then we have Morbid Angel with Gateways to Annihilation. Album 7 for this foundational Florida band, and the last with Eric Rutan on guitar. Summoning Redemption is a killer groovy opener that feels like it could have been on Domination, but after that, they start leaning a bit more heavily into the doom elements with this more droning vibe, especially on tracks like He Who Sleeps. A couple other decent tracks here, like To the Victor, The Spoils, and also very Where the Slime Lives, At One with Nothing, and some solid atmosphere also, but overall this just loses a lot of what was interesting about the last two albums for me, so it's going to great tier. Then we have Abramelin with Dead Speak. The second album from this Australian band, following up the self-titled debut I already sang praises for in 1995. Just all-around killer death metal, mixing quite a few influences with clear elements of Swedish bands like Dismember and some of the guitar work, but also a brutality more akin to Dying Fetus or Cannibal Corpse. It's kind of the perfect fusion of so many of my favorite things, so that took it to amazing. Then there's Broken Torso with The Ultimate Abhorrence. Another one-and-done album, this time out of Austria, getting a lot of blackened energy from these guitars that, alongside the battering drums, feels like a more aggressive take on Dissection with deep, girthy death growls. Certainly a record for banging your head, but also with a lot of character coming through in the dark melodies of the guitar leads, and at just 27 tight minutes, there's really no excuse to not give this a spin. It landed at killer for me. Then there's Brodekin with Instruments of Torture. The debut album from this Knoxville, Tennessee brutal death metal band specializing in all manner of torture. Sheer brutality, nothing more, nothing less. Just a pure, undiluted barrage of pingy snare, grindy distortion, and brie. Fun if bordering on a caricature of the genre, and the shtick gets old for me pretty fast, so it landed at okay. But again, there's really not like a bad album on this list. I still enjoyed listening to this one. Then we have The Haunted with Made Me Do It. When former members of At the Gates mix groove metal with melodic death metal, you get a match made in heaven, if you ask me. I neglected to include this band's debut on the 1998 list, but this being one of my favorites, it had to be on here. Trespass, Leech, Hollow Ground, Silencer, really no duds here. I love this album, so it's again hard to not put it in perfection, but I'll admit that it's maybe not as death metal as some of the other picks here, so I'll justify that in my reasoning for why it's at fantastic. Then there's Children of Bodom with Fear the Reaper. Vastly improves on everything from the first two albums, even stronger standouts in Bodom After Midnight, Children of Decadence, Mask of Sanity. More epic tracks like Every Time I Die. The production is stepped up, crazier riffs, shreddier solos, synthier synths, and stronger vocals overall too. It has to go to perfection for these Finns. We have Quo Vadis with Day into Night.
Think you've got the control. Let's take your words I heard before. Check the path, walk the line.
Another unexpected slapper on this list from this defunct Canadian band with a good mix of bluesy groove and melodic death metal, and in addition to the more Gothenburg and Carcassy sounding elements, I also get a touch of Opeth and even Rotting Christ on tracks like Let It Burn, as well as instrumentals like Dream. Loving the riffs yet again on this one, it is going to Killer. Then we have Disembarkation with Rancorous Observision. The singular full-length album from this technical progressive death metal band out of Quebec, formed in 1995. Pretty interesting stuff that in some ways reminds me of Atheist, but with a kind of tribal drumming energy at times and their own twist on the vocals. I also see Mekong Delta in their similar artist page, which says a lot if you know about them. Definitely weird at times, but in a good way. Another more obscure one, too, that I'm glad to have stumbled upon. It went to amazing. Then we have Inhume with Decomposing from Inside. The debut full-length from this Netherlands brutal death and grindcore band formed in 1994. In spite of how putrid and pummeling this album is, the production is excellent, making for one of the better death grind releases we've covered. The drums, vocals, and guitar are all super crisp, which make the snare hits all the more vicious. This one landed at great tier. Then there's Nunslaughter with Hell's Unholy Fire. This is an album for fans of the rawest of the raw. The production is more on the early black metal spectrum. The songwriting is very cookie cutter. Track lengths are largely under 2 minutes in more of the grindcore tradition, and I'd also argue that the raspy vocals also fall more in between that and black metal as opposed to death metal. I like raw, but this just feels pretty mediocre to me, so landed at okay. Then we have The Crown with Death Race King. Album 2, at least under this name for this Swedish band, and actually the highest rated on Metal Storm. Interesting fusion of melodic death metal with more bluesy elements, like that solo on Executioner just goes full Motorhead, and tracks like Devilgate Ride and Rebel Angel have some full-on southern dirtbag vibes. Some pretty killer riffing, but I'm not in love with the vocal performance or how it fits into the mix, and just overall the songwriting can be hit and miss for me. I think that The Haunted just brings this energy a lot better for me, so this just landed at good for me. Then we have The Chasm with Procession to the Infraworld. Album 4 from this Mexico City band, and continuing to mature and blossom from the last one. Love the stepped up atmosphere right from the opening intro, and then moving into The Scars of My Journey. It's clear that they've been taking some notes from Opeth too. So take that sound and then combine it with much more aggressive blast beat infused stuff like Fading. I can see why it's their highest rated album on Metal Storm and Metal Archives. Another one that would have been even higher if not for the competition here. It went to amazing. Then we have Decapitated with Winds of Creation. The debut album from this popular Polish tech death band. Fantastic riffs on this thing and extremely technical right from the start, especially for a group of kids who only ranged from 15 to 18 at the time. So many bangers here, traversing a gauntlet right from the start with the title track and Blessed before detouring into the groovier The First Damned. The vocals could be a little bit more interesting, but other than that, it just gets better every time I hear it. It went to perfection. Then we have Cattle Decapitation with Humivore. The second release from this California band, here still in the more death grind style of their early days before shifting more overtly into death metal on the next album. I still feel weird calling this an LP as it's only 21 minutes, but again, just like the last one, I got chewed out by a few people for not including it in their discography ranking. So definitely not among my favorites from them, as I prefer the post-monolith of Inhumanity stuff, but it's a nice grimy listen if you just want something gore-filled and gross, and I always enjoy Travis Ryan's vocals, so this one went to great tier. Now, if you really want something grimy and gory, though, that's even better, we've got Exhumed with Slaughter Cult. Album 2 from this also grindy California band, following up Gore Metal in 1998, which was quite enjoyable. Every song feels like a flurry of knives just splattering blood all over the walls. Just pure violence transcribed into guitar, drums, and demented vocals. Gnarly stuff, and also fairly concise at just under 35 minutes. So this one went to Killer. Then we have Contrastic with Contrastic. One of just 2 full lengths from this Czechia death and experimental grindcore band. I'd argue that this is much more of a grindcore album than anything else here, with a ratio of about 70-30, but it was on the list and it's batshit insane, and since I don't cover much grind, I figured why not.
Let's get weird, buddy. Let's get weird.
What follows is a cacophony of, yes, blast beats and chaotic screams, but also almost Nintendo core electronics and plenty of cowbell.
I got a fever, and the only prescription is more...
Pretty unreal stuff. I'll put it at good tier. Then we have Christian with Conquerors of Armageddon. Album 3, and if you ask me, a marked step up from the previous 2 for this Brazilian band, who I am hopefully properly pronouncing now. Much better production, likely thanks in large part due to signing to Century Media and stepping up the songwriting, delivering more technical performances as well. I draw plenty of comparisons to Behemoth's sound around the same time, but also Hate Eternal, Deicide, and Vital Remains. More recently, I'd also say that Vitriol is taking plenty of notes from this chaotic precision guitar work. They landed at fantastic. Then we have 6 Feet Under with Graveyard Classics.
How embarrassing.
I generally avoid including cover albums because I don't consider them to be true LPs, but this one is just so legendary for all the wrong reasons. Also, funnily enough, Smoke on the Water is probably the first song I ever heard from this band, and even back then I remember laughing my ass off about it. Seriously, how are you going to butcher, no pun intended, some truly great songs? Black Sabbath, Dead Kennedys, Jimi Hendrix. Honestly, with this one, okay is being generous. It should just be in bad, but I'm not going to make an extra tier.
Everyone in this room is now dumber for having listened to it. I award you no points, and may God have mercy on your soul.
Then we have Dismember with Hate Campaign. Album 6 from these Swedes, and coming off hot on the heels of one of their best albums in my opinion in 1997's Death Metal. This one feels like a step back from that, but I do like it a lot more than Massive Killing Capacity, bringing more awesome classic melodeath riffing on the likes of Retaliate, Enslaved to Bitterness, and Patrol 17. It's a little inconsistent with a few tracks that feel pretty forgettable, but strong. Overall, it went to Killer. Then we have Eternal Tears of Sorrow with Chaotic Beauty. Another band I was not previously familiar with, but now I feel like I should be, as they share a lot of elements with Kalmah and not only hail from the same country, but share a few members. Extremely infectious riffs with a folky tinge and incredible symphonic atmosphere to boot. Love the harpsichord on Tar of Chaos. Some comparisons to Insomnium as well. This landed at amazing. Then we have Cryptopsy with And Then You'll Beg. Appropriate to the title, it feels like the Canadians were doubling down on the brutality here, even taking on a more raw production sound that reminds me a bit of the debut. Heavy emphasis on technical performances here and some improvements to the vocals with the previous album, but they still get a little haphazard and even goofy sounding at times. And despite how impressive the performances are, I don't find the songwriting to be quite as tight or memorable, so this went to great tier. Then there's Immolation with Close to a World Below. The fourth and my personal favorite album from this New York band. The fiery sound of the guitars is amplified by 1000 alongside apocalyptic sounding barrages of drumming. The whole thing just conjures this image in my head of this giant blaze just billowing out of cracks opening in the earth with demons crawling out. Furthest from the truth even sounds like being sucked into a void, just ravaging from start to finish, and a huge step up from the previous albums. This went to fantastic, but again, strong case for perfection. Like, honestly, consider these top 2 tiers to be like almost equal. So I did it again. I know every list we end up leaving off some albums because it's just impossible to include everything, but this one was a personal favorite of mine that I could not go without. And before I get to the last album, I thought I'd share that. Also, honorable mentions to Macabre with Dahmer and Rune Magic with Resurrection in Blood, but the record in question here needs to be Extol with Undeceived. I still pretty vividly remember hearing Inferno for the first time in a used record store and picking this thing up as a result of that title track alone. Just an incredible song that makes this Norwegian album noteworthy on its own, but then you've got the title track, Ember, and Where Sleep Is Rest. In retrospect, this feels like a very unique fusion of Carcass with like later career Death and Atheist, with its incredible technical performances and progressive songwriting. Maybe a little clunky at times in its construction as a full album, but I still have a soft spot for it, and it is a very highly recommended listen, so on here I would probably put it at fantastic. And then we have Dying Fetus with Destroy the Opposition. That intro to Praise the Lord has to be one of the most recognizable death metal hooks of all time. This is the album that got me into the band and was also a big gateway into the more brutal side of the genre in general. Great drumming on the title track, the blast beats are insane, and the guitar sweeps on this album are also absolutely nuts. Each track is a little different from the last, so it feels a bit more differentiated and memorable than the previous two as a result, and so ultimately, this one also had to go to perfection. Y'all check out this playlist for more death metal rankings by year for the entire 90s. I also did a video for the 80s. Or check out this video for something different. But that'll do it for now. Flight of Icarus signing off. I will see you in the trenches.